Tonight, there's war overseas and rising tensions at home. America, once the benchmark for democracy, is now bitterly divided. And the Middle East and Ukraine are locked in protracted wars. Tonight, we have a panel of writers and big thinkers ready to take your questions. Julian Borger is the World Affairs Editor for The Guardian, based in Washington. Journalist Alisa Sopova hails from the Russian-occupied region of Donetsk in Ukraine. Maher Mughrabi is features editor at The Age newspaper in Melbourne. Abdulrazak Gurnah is a Tanzanian British Nobel laureate for literature. And Deborah Cheetham Fraillon treads the boards of international concert halls as one of Australia's best-known sopranos. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we are meeting. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Dušak Milojevic.
Good evening, panel. Should Australia seriously consider leaving international bodies such as the UN and International Criminal Court when decisions that don't favour us are made?
Julian.
I think if you support international legal institutions only when they don't go after your friends and your political allies, then maybe you don't believe in the rule of law altogether. I mean, that's the basis of law, isn't it? The equality before the law, individuals, governments. And I just think if you try and figure out what advances we've made as humanity since the Holocaust, since slavery, since colonialism. I would point to the UN Charter and the aspirations in that, and I would point to the ICC and this idea that we as humanity will not put up with certain crimes. They are crimes against humanity. And this is something that protects us all. It may be a kind of rickety, underfunded, frail protection, but it's all we've got. And I think if you're prepared to give that up for political advantage, for your political allies, then I think that's just the height of short-sightedness.
OK, well, there is a debate, as you know, in Australia about that at the moment. The opposition has suggested perhaps pulling out of the ICC. I just want to go back to you, if I can, Julian, because one of the arguments is that the prosecutor's decision to announce the applications together for, the two Israeli leaders, the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister and the three leaders of Hamas at the same time, put them on a level playing field. Do you think that optically that was a problem? No,
that's his job. His mandate is to look at the crimes committed on a certain territory by all parties. That's literally his mandate. They're not accused of the same things. There's some overlap, but Hamas are accused of rape, torture, holding hostages, crimes against humanity and war crimes. The Israeli government primarily is being held to account for the use of starvation as a weapon of war against the civilian population. They are very different.
They are different charges, but on the question of equivalence on the basis of the announcement being at the same time, can you see that the optics will look mismanaged?
Again, it is his job to address crimes committed by all parties on the same territory. He doesn't really have a choice in the matter.
Alisa, how do you see it?
Well, isn't the equality of everyone in front of law one of the basic assumptions of law? So if we say that, oh, these two people, yeah, I don't see the problem here.
No, I think the term moral equivalence is an insult to people's intelligence. I think if you had on the same docket on the same day a person who was a career criminal and a person who was being charged for the first time, the person who's being charged for the first time and the career criminal are not morally equivalent. The only equivalence that they have is that they're both subject to the rule of law. I think what really outrages the United States and Israel about this decision is that for the first time, Israel has to be accountable to someone other than itself.
Abdulrazak, one of the issues here is the ICC has been seen, I'm looking now at the history of the ICC, as going after perhaps leaders in Africa, but turning a blind eye to other countries, particularly in the West.
Well, precisely, that it's countries that feel powerful enough to say, I don't care, can continue to do so, including the United States, including Russia, China. None of these have signed up to the ICC, and therefore the decisions of the ICC are neither here nor there for them. Other countries, actually, oddly enough, the United Kingdom is a signatory. But the ICC was only created after the Second World War. And Britain very, very cleverly did most of its crimes before.
Well, I was about to say, it would be so convenient for Australia to opt out. And there will be a day of reckoning here. The crimes committed against First Nations people.
Absolutely.
And I think at a time when we have a truth and telling and a justice commission and treaty in several states, while that's still on a path to success, I think that's what has actually prompted this statement right here from at home.
It's actually a great point. And when I was preparing, I was thinking about it and wondering whether this might be the reason. But then I thought, I don't know the history of Australia that well. I'm not there to make assumptions, but you're right. So I think that Australians should also think about what company they want to be in if they pull out. Because 99% of countries that pull out of ICC are the countries that committed war crimes and they have something to be persecuted for. And the only country, as far as I know, that is not a member of ICC for another reason is China. And that is the reason that China doesn't want to persecute its partners who might have committed crimes. So do we want
the
to...
United States, right? So
United States in the first bucket, right, who doesn't want to be persecuted itself. So basically, you have to choose the company you want to be in.
And in fact, there is now some agitation in the UK, particularly from the right, to say, let's pull out, because they don't like the fact that somebody dares to say that whatever they do is somehow wrong.
Next, we'll hear from Scott Clark.
Good evening. Is it fair to say that Hamas's actions on the 7th of October has positively changed the narrative of the Palestinian cause and the way it's viewed by governments around the world and in Australia?
Maher.
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word positive, but what I would say about this is that the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, said something very telling, I thought, the other day. He said that there was peace on October the 6th. Now, on one level, that's palpable nonsense. The fact is that 2023 was, on the West Bank, which is not the place that is being bombarded now, was the most violent year since 2005, since the end of the Second Intifada, for Palestinians. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed. 80 children were killed on the West Bank in 2023. So it was a lethal year. There was no peace on October the 6th. So on one level, it's nonsense, as I said. But on another level, on the crude level of power and of the political and media class, the fact is that all those Palestinians dying wasn't news. It didn't ripple the surface. It didn't disturb the surface of the water. Hamas understood, for better or worse, what would create a disturbance, what would disturb the surface, and that was the death of large numbers of Israelis, and so that's what they did. They did something that couldn't be ignored, because the deaths of Israelis count, and the deaths of Arabs don't count. And they upended Israeli assumptions about the idea that the conflict could be managed. So they certainly created a situation where the Palestinians and their situation couldn't be ignored. But whether that was, and from that point of view, I suppose some Palestinians would say it's a positive thing. But I have to say, the price that the Palestinians have paid for the decision that Hamas made is so terribly high that I can't use the word positively.
Yeah, I was about to go to that because, yeah, I mean, Julian, the death toll for Palestinians has been incredibly high.
I was just going to add on that Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, had written this piece looking at the world that was supposed to go out in Foreign Affairs later in October. In it, he said, well, the Middle East is relatively stable, and now we can pivot over and to Asia, this long-desired pivot to confront China, and they had to edit that out after 7th of October so he wouldn't look completely blinded. But it is a blindness in the US policy class. They just do not see Palestinians. No. And until they started dying in such terrible numbers, the Palestinian deaths were invisible and it was seen as peace.
Yeah.
This is part of the issue, though, isn't it? That October the 7th, which was such a horrendous day for Israelis, the mass murder of, you know, so many people, but those young people at that music festival are seared in my memory. You know, people going out, young people to have a joyful experience in incredible numbers. It changed everything. It changed the psyche in Israel, and it's clearly changed the course of this war, right? It's made everything different. It is a definitive moment like I don't think I've seen in my lifetime in this war. So I suppose the question is, Hamas, in some ways, through all of this discussion we're having, is being rewarded, is it not, for changing the discourse?
In what way is it being rewarded?
That's the argument, that they are getting their issues debated like
But they're
never
not their
before.
issues. They don't belong to Hamas. They belong to the whole Palestinian people. The Hamas are the ones who are willing to fight and willing to attack and willing to kill people to make their point. But what I would say is, and this is, I mean this most sincerely, I hear people here say, all lives matter, and I hear people say that they cringe and they recoil when they see the violence of the Israeli state in Gaza. But I have to say, I don't hear anybody who's willing to stand up and fight for the Palestinians. I don't hear anybody who's willing to put their political or their economic credentials on the line to save Palestinian lives. If you leave a vacuum where you're not fighting for the Palestinians, yes, Hamas are going to fill that vacuum every single day of the week. And that's the tragedy. The tragedy is that you have left the field as an international community to Hamas. If you don't want Hamas in the centre of the field, take the centre of the field. Fight for the Palestinians.
A powerfully expressed point. I could see you trying to get in there.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of change and possible changes of the narrative, I cannot believe that with all the talk about what is going on, we're still conflating Hamas and Palestinian civilians, which is kind of logical fallacy that is deployed by purposefully, I imagine, by governments whenever they need to make this point. So I think if we are still not distinguishing between Hamas and Palestinian civilians, and also between Israeli state, the state of Israel, and Jewish people elsewhere, and then every criticism of Jewish states suddenly becomes anti-Semitism, as if we forget that there are so many Jewish people, including myself, who do not support what the state of Israel is doing. Then, so even if we are still committing so easily this very simple logical mistake, I don't know if the narrative has really improved.
The point about the conflation of, you know, the government or the structure with the people is a very important point, I think, Deborah, because that has happened as we're having our own debates here, very far away, but about our views on the war and the way that we should express them. There has been kind of motive put on people based on their cultural or religious backgrounds. How do you reflect on the way we're having those debates?
Well, October last year was a devastating month around the world and here at home. I was standing on stage in Melbourne on October the 14th when the nation decided that First Nations people would not have a voice to Parliament in this country. I kind of thought that that was going to be the result. I didn't hold out much hope. But 65%, that was really devastating. Instantly, it became apparent that there would be no more discourse about this matter, that everything turned towards the conflict overseas. And it's not that the two should be mutually exclusive, but almost instantly, and quite typically, I would say, of the Australian population, not ever one to look inward and to examine the contents of its own character, looking outwards and pouring a sort of confused hatred into one side or the other with such ugliness, you would think that we were living in the Northern Hemisphere. It's not that we shouldn't pay attention, it's not that we shouldn't be informed, but it's almost as if we cannot look at our own crimes against humanity here. And there'll be those who'll rush to their keyboards right now to shoot me down in flames, but I'm not talking just about First Nations people in this country, I'm talking about everybody. Everybody who came here since 1788. Because what diminishes First Nations people in this land diminishes us all. Yes. And the fact that Australians have struggled to understand that is being lived out on the streets right now with people who are protesting with very little information, I would say, on occasion. There are those who are informed and there are those who are jumping to a set of conclusions that if they were asked to explain what's actually going on and the history of this space that is being contested and those lives that have been lost in that space, they wouldn't be able to explain it to you.
We'll keep this discussion going with a question from Patrick Quinn.
Thank you. Given that the phrase "from the river to the sea" has been deemed anti-Semitic, and any criticism of Israel, that's the state, not the Jewish people themselves, gets called out as being anti-Semitic, even when Jewish people do it. And this week, just being in possession of an Irish accent means you can be accused of being anti-Semitic. Can we trust our legislators with the new anti-vilification laws that they are proposed to not misuse them, especially given the way we actually managed to not look after our whistleblowers?
Yeah, and you're referring to laws, for those who aren't across it, that the Albanese government is proposing on anti-vilification. We don't know the detail yet, but they will be pretty strong laws, they say, to deal with racism and discrimination on the basis of religion. So obviously there's going to be a strong debate, Alisa, about what that looks like and so forth. But terms like river to the sea are very inflammatory. They're used, you might not see it as inflammatory, but many people say that they are to them and that's how they hear it.
But Jewish people also use them.
And some Jewish people object to them, right? So that's the point.
But how it's anti-Semitic is the question. Is it?
Well, I'll put that to the panel. It's an interesting question, but it is contested space.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know the Australian context well enough to make any far-reaching claims. I think as a journalist, I'm always suspicious of any kind of government regulations. They try to tell what should be said
Exactly.
and what should not be said.
If you are going to create a problem around the word intifada, I used the word fight earlier. Now, the word fight has a lot of associations. When you say you're going to fight for your rights, you can mean that you're going to take up a petition, or you're going to campaign, or it can mean that you're going to start punching people out, or it can mean that you're going to pick up a gun, right? Fight can mean all those things. Are they going to ban the word fight on university campuses? Intifada is a word that means, well, literally it means to shake off.
Yeah, but it has a particular memory for people in Israel.
That may be, but it has a particular memory for Palestinians as well, which is of civil disobedience, of strikes.
But Jewish people remember it in a very specific way, in the form of suicide bombings and deaths in Israel. I mean, that's a real experience, and they've made that quite clear. So we need to be aware of that.
You are going to forbid the word on that basis. You're going to forbid the word on that basis.
I'm not forbidding anything.
No, but I mean,
having a good discussion.
But if the government moves to do that, if it makes one community's view on a word the metric, one community that here enjoys more political power than the Arab community does at the moment, where does that end precisely? And can I just say about the river to the sea, because this is very important. This is very important. I will say this about the river to the sea. The river to the sea is about geography, okay? It's about the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, okay? Now, between those two geographical features at the moment, what we have is a Jewish supremacy. It's a regime of Jewish supremacy. That's what we have right now. Freedom
Well, it's Israel. It's the Israeli state.
Well, no, it's not the Israeli state, because in the occupied territories, the Israeli state is suspended. It's a military occupation. So it's a Jewish supremacy from one side to the other, a state that privileges Jewish existence over Arab existence. Now, the freedom, Palestine shall be free. We call that geography Palestine, and lots of people call that geography Palestine. It wasn't contentious. It's been in the English language for hundreds of years, right? We call that geography Palestine. Between the river and the sea, Palestine will be free. Freedom is not a political arrangement. Freedom is a human condition. But not only that, it's an essential precondition for any political arrangement you care to name, whether it's a one-state solution, a two-state solution, John Bolton's three-state solution, Shimon Peres's confederation with Jordan. Any of these arrangements, first to be entered into, the people undertaking them have to be free. This is what Nelson Mandela said. He said, prisoners cannot negotiate, only free men can enter into contracts.
But I've got to interrupt, because the chant does not talk about everyone and equal rights.
It says from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Yeah, so it refers to one state, does it not?
It refers to a geography and freedom within that geography.
All right. Deborah, obviously you know that many Jewish people have expressed, certainly in this country, I have heard them, we've had them on the panel, I've countless times, that when they hear that term, they hear it as a genocidal statement. That's how they hear it.
Yes.
And, well, they have a right to also express how they hear it. Given that's their experience, and we do try to listen to each other in this country, but probably, you know, with varied success, is it something that we should reconsider?
We're no strangers to genocide here in Australia. I'm the great-granddaughter of a man who returned to his family camp to see his entire family massacred. You know, it's a really slippery slope. From the river to the sea, let's ban that. How about always was, always will be?
Indeed.
Aboriginal people don't come out on a very good side of the law in this country. So once that's in place, it will be used against Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
So I'm not in favour of
And this is a very important point, because always will be Aboriginal land. If you're a member of, let's say, I don't know, the Nationals, you might hear it as, my sovereignty in this country as an Australian is under threat. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. That's a question mark over the sovereignty of this country, is it not?
Well, that's already happening. The Nationals have banned any more expenditure on acknowledgements
the Victorian State Nationals in opposition have just passed a motion. Just clarifying the details, because they're not actually in government, but that's what they've suggested.
No, they're not.
But when you say always was, always will be Aboriginal land, right, you are saying there is a question mark over the sovereignty of this country.
Well, Abdulrazak, there are questions, though, around the language we use. We constantly have debates around language that's acceptable when we're talking about questions of race, gender, sexuality, because the legislation, can I say, we're talking about anti-Semitism, but it's going to be more far-reaching for those. We just haven't had the other parts of the discussion yet. Should there be limits on speech?
Well, you have to start a little further back, as I see it. When an idea, which is not necessarily anti-libertarian, but rather protective of say, minorities, when that is hijacked by people who make out, it seems to me, to be more sensitive than they need to be about words, what they're losing is the way such a law is actually necessary to protect those who are actually otherwise not protected. For example, when such a law was introduced in the UK, say, the Race Relations Act in the 1960s, it was still possible, before that law came in, for important people to stand up, important in the sense that they have an audience, a national audience maybe, or in any case an audience large, to stand up and say quite obnoxious and cruel and in many respects provocative things, provoking other citizens into aggression, and to not be reprimanded or to be stopped or to be accused of anything. But after that law came into being, with a lot of protests from many different areas, then this became something criminal. You could be prosecuted for doing that. And so we don't have that language anymore. Whatever people say when they're at home or behind, in their own private spaces, they can't stand up and publicly announce aggressive, nasty, mean things about other people, or indeed women, or indeed for people of different sexual orientations, and so on. So in itself, the idea, the rationale for it, it doesn't seem to me to be necessarily anti-libertarian. It's what use is put to, and how much control can be put on it. So when people get upset about from the river to the sea and say this is anti-Semitic, this is a kind of nonsense that then makes those kinds of laws authoritarian. So the balance is not in not having one at all, but in having one so that you can use it in a sensible way and not have it, as it were, possible to be hijacked by anybody who says I'm too sensitive. This upsets me.
Can I just say one more small thing about Intifada? If you go onto the website of the US Holocaust Museum and you look up the page on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the US Holocaust Museum has mirror websites in other languages, including Arabic. And on the Arabic website, the translation of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is Intifadat al-Hayy al-Yahudi fi Warsaw, the Intifada of the Jewish Quarter in Warsaw. That's what it's called. If you outlaw the word Intifada and say it's hate speech, they're going to have to fix their website.
There's no doubt that the word means something else, but it also has a particular memory in Israel, and that was the question,
The word's associations a word cannot be banned because of its associations. It can't.
Our next question comes from Nipan Agarwal, and it's a video
If
question.
Donald Trump gets elected this year, is there going to be a war between the East and the West?
Well, that's a very sharp question. I'll go to you, Julian.
I think in the short term, there's less likely to be because he's a transactional leader. He is far more likely to abandon allies than go to war for them. And say what you like about Trump, he did agree to leave Afghanistan. He does not believe in using American money and American lives overseas for people we don't know and don't care about. So in the short term, there is an argument to say less likely. But I think that in the longer term, if the America's adversaries, Russia, China, are unsure or believe that they can push forward and they will get to a place or they will strike somewhere where there'll be American lives lost. And Trump, as we've seen, is a very volatile leader. Yes. It can lead to, there's more chance, I think, of miscalculation.
Right.
With a set of alliances, you kind of know where you are. But with Trump, we probably won't.
Yeah, indeed.
Alisa?
Yeah,
You live in the US.
I do live in the US, yes. I mean, if Trump gets elected, it's going to be terrible for Ukraine, obviously. It's going to be pretty bad for the US, not as bad for Ukraine, I imagine, but bad as well.
How much anxiety is there amongst Ukrainians about this looming election?
There is a lot. There is a lot, and it's connected to our understanding, Ukrainians' understanding that unfortunately we are in this kind of pretty humiliating position where we depend on everything from abroad, and we are getting a lot of kind of drop feeding, and it's enough for any change to close this drop feeding. So it's bad for us. I don't think that it's. I agree with Julian that in short term, I don't see it happening because Trump is a lot of in a way, in his idiosyncratic way, he's an isolationist, and also he seems to like Putin. He seems to kind of.
He admires him.
Not.
Let's face it.
Yeah, but he doesn't seem very keen on fighting him.
Not at all. No.
Right.
Abdulrazak, obviously, I feel like throughout this year, and I'm sure the audience and people who've been watching would relate to this, everything has really been couched within the prism of this looming US election and the way it might reshape the world. When you think of Trump, and we have these discussions about colonisation and the kind of consequences of it, he is very protectionist and it's inward-looking. How do you see the US's reach in a sort of second Trump presidency?
Well, the US generally is terrifying in its global performances, I suppose. I mean, if you think only of what happens between the US and Europe, that seems to be something like a kind of a civilized exchange or encounter. But for many places in the rest of the world, the US is just a mortal beast that does what it wants. I don't know, we don't know how many military bases there are in the world, and in Africa, in Asia, in the middle of oceans, in the Antarctica, anywhere you like. They do what they like. So, and I think of that, and I think of Trump as the man kind of with a word to say about any of this. It seems to me even more terrifying. The unpredictability of it, what Julian referred to, but anyway, we've seen that already. But there are also other ways in which I find the idea of Trump as the President of the United States terrifying, domestic as well as international. It isn't just the war between East and West. That probably is not going to happen. But other things will happen. The persecution of migrants, for example.
Absolutely.
The various almost demented way in which he speaks about Americans, fellow Americans who are not on his side. Sometimes you think, how is it possible for anybody to vote for Trump?
Yeah, I just want to throw something in there, not absolutely to say that Trump would be good in any way, but just something to add to Trump's volatility. In the Cold War, there was the theory of madman theory, right? That actually the best strategy for the United States vis-a-vis Soviet Union would be to act as a madman, like who can pull out of it tomorrow or go all in tomorrow, so that people in the Soviet Union are not sure what to expect and just try to keep it low. And it feels like in some kind of weird irony.
Yeah, back there.
Many years later, America is actually getting the madman. So maybe we might hope that this theory would work and prevent.
But you see, that would only work if the madman, I think it was Nixon, wasn't it? Who was
that's right, that's right.
That would only work if the other lot were being sane.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Alisa Sopova, Maher Mughrabi, Julian Borger, Deborah Cheetham Fraillon and Abdulrazak Gurnah. Lots to get to tonight. Here's Sophia Meniachi.
After the negative result from the Voice referendum, how can Australians move forward in terms of reconciliation?
Deborah. It is Reconciliation Week, of course, this week.
Yes, it is Reconciliation Week, and the theme is now more than ever. Just last week, I laid to rest with the rest of my family a great woman in our family. of my generation. She was an academic, a powerhouse, such a brilliant thinker. And I thought myself, here it is at last. My generation are now leaving this realm. And we haven't achieved what our ancestors were working towards in their lifetime. The loss of my cousin is deeply felt, but also that realisation that here we are, it's my generation now. And what about my children? Will they still be waiting for the same justice? I don't think I have an answer right now to the question, except that it is going to be in your hands. Here you are, I don't know, are you in year 11, year 10, 11, 12?
Year 10.
Year 10, okay. You are in year 10. You know more about the history of this country than any generation before you. Certainly you know a lot more than I knew about my own people when I was in year 10. It places a great burden on your shoulders. It's never too early to start the conversations with your friends about what reconciliation means to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, that it is not just a one-way street of opportunity for Indigenous Australians, that it is an opportunity for all Australians to come to terms with our past and to build the kind of future that we want to pass on to our children, one in which we have a deep and abiding connection to this land that we live on, and one in which we finally understand that we belong to this land. It does not belong to us. Reconciliation, I don't know. After October 14, I think it just was so far out of reach. But then I think back to the early 90s and Paul Keating's Redfern Address, where we could almost touch it, where we could almost taste what reconciliation and a true acknowledgement of the history of this country, we could almost sense it. And if you haven't read the Redfern Address, please do. Because I've lived through the years since then and I've seen things change and I've seen them slowly, at a glacial pace, improve. So I hold on to that one little glimmer of hope that after the Keating years we emerged, we were thrown into the 13 winters of Howard and then we emerged from that. But I don't know. I think until we have Indigenous leadership in this country, we're never really going to see the change because we're asking the people who inflicted it all on us to make the change. And I don't see it happening.
Sophia, I want to bring you back in if I can. I just want to know what motivated you to ask that question.
Well, during the, actual time of the Voice referendum, before it came out, I was attending a lot of seminars and stuff. And by the way, based on what I had heard at those, I definitely thought that a yes was inevitable. So I was so shocked, especially by the majority no. And I just thought you would be a really great, source of information for me. And yeah, I feel a little, I'm trying to think of the word. It's crushing, honestly. And yeah, I feel lost.
There are a couple of things there. One of the really chilling articles that I read in the aftermath of the referendum result was the correlation between massacre sites in Australia and the no booths. You can basically put a map of the no booths on top of a map of massacre sites. So nothing has changed there. Or very little has changed. And I think what Australia woke up to on the 15th of October was the reality that Indigenous people and basically people of colour in this country not just Indigenous First Australians. But we woke up to the reality that First Nations people and others who are on the margins live every day. The kind of racism that I face daily in this country, people struggle to believe the kind of racism that I face every day. And yet, I don't know, I was still crushed by the 65%. I just want to go back to something that was said earlier, and it's not exactly on your question, but I want to dispel a myth here. I've never seen America as the benchmark of democracy. I haven't. It's one of those myths. Ask the first people of that continent if they think that America was the benchmark of democracy. Most definitely not. Native American Indians struggle today for recognition. I think we just build up these stories and we just accept them. And we're a country that will accept something as simple and as insidious and as stupid as, if you don't know, vote no.
Yeah.
Next, I want to hear from Scott Cochrane.
Hey, in the past week, we've seen Australia's richest person take exception to an Indigenous artist's portrait of her appearing, amongst others, in the National Gallery of Australia. To Deborah, as someone who melds colonial art forms with First Nations stories, what do you make of the controversy and what that says about Australia post-voice referendum?
Okay, so this is Gina Reinhardt and the reporting actually in your newspaper, Maher, about pulling the image of her in the exhibition.
Well, first of all, I personally do not believe that opera is a colonial art form. It's another one of those myths that is built up that somehow it was invented in Italy 300 and something years ago. Sung narrative, painting up and putting on costume, sung story, that was invented here in Australia something like 2,000 generations ago. Bel canto technique, definitely. But I don't actually accept that opera is a colonial form. But I take where you're coming from there. Vincent Namgira's style was evident in all 21 portraits. As far as I know, for those subjects of the portraits in that collection who are still living, only one complaint. I think that the important thing to remember about the arts, visual arts in this case, is what the artist sees. If you want a reflection of what you see, then perhaps, you know,
Well,
she has the palm of a photographer who's willing to, light things just so.
But there is such a painting. I mean, she submitted a painting that she would like put in the gallery as a replacement. And there is such a painting. But I mean, I think...
put that there as well.
But we don't yet live in the monarchy of Gina Reinhardt.
Well,
so.
and you know, it didn't happen, right?
No,
That's the thing, it never happened.
But I think what's more interesting about the story, you said it appeared in our paper, and you're right, and I think what's more interesting about the story, though, is the fact that the people who complained to the gallery on Gina's behalf were the Australian swimming team, members of the Australian swimming team, which, of course, Gina is a very, very generous patron of. And when Palestinians talk about Israeli sport washing and Saudi Arabian sport washing of their human rights abuses or these sorts of things, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea that some rich people have, that having paid the piper, they can call the tune. Clearly, that's how Gina expects this to work. She pays for the swimmers, and now she expects the swimmers to go into bat for her about her painting that she doesn't like. You know, fair enough.
Abdulrazak, I mean, a lot of your work focuses on how colonial structures, you know, operate, particularly, obviously, in Africa. Just through that prism of how art intersects with calling powerful institutions to account and tells those stories. Talk to me about that tension that exists as you tell those stories. I mean, this was an Indigenous painter in this particular story that played out spectacularly across Australia and was, can I say, the biggest talking point in our country for a few days. But questioning power is really what outsiders do, right?
Yeah, I didn't know the story, and I wish I did.
You do now.
Yeah. I mean, I had more context. But I suppose there's some kinds of art forms. Some art forms require patronage, or rather require more patronage than other art forms. So something like that is kind of vulnerable. I would have said, visual arts, perhaps something which is going to be exhibited in a museum or in a gallery requires more of that kind of patronage and support. So perhaps, therefore, is more vulnerable to that kind of interference. There's very little you can do to prevent words being said and written. You see, this is so it's rather different there. I suppose it could affect publication and distribution, but it's a little bit harder to do, I think.
Have you ever felt censored?
Well, I think that has increased publication.
Okay, there is that as well.
There has been a public funding drive to raise enough money to actually put this image in Times Square. And they have raised the money, and Vincent has agreed to it. Yes, has been successful. So it's going to be out there, Gina, I'm sorry to say.
I know, but that has come about in a singular case, if you like, in a case which becomes, publicly known in this way. There must be many, many instances when such prohibitions, as it were, happen out of sight, and it doesn't become a public issue like this.
You were going to ask him, has that happened to you?
Thank you. Thanks, Maher.
No.
As
far as I know, nobody has said, shut that man up. No.
Well, we have not shut you up once. Let's hear now from Paul Hoy Nguyen.
Do you think we have provided enough financial support to Ukraine? And should Australia do more to offer financial aid to Ukraine?
Oh, well, to my knowledge, Australian support to Ukraine has pretty much fallen in line with otherwise Western. It always feels weird to say Western in Australia, but kind of politically Western support to Ukraine in a sense that it's been inconsistent and late, often very late, reminding that the war in Ukraine started in 2014. And speaking of that Hamas didn't attack out of the blue sky, Russia also didn't attack in 2022 out of the blue sky. If there was all this help and all this effort before 2022, maybe it would never happen. Speaking of Australian support, ironically, just today it's been in the news that Australia basically denied Ukraine a shipment of coal that the Ukrainian government asked for because our electric and heating infrastructure is severely damaged and we need it for the winter. And as far as I understood, the reason cited for the denial was that that would go against Australians' aspiration to reduce fossil fuel use. And, as somebody who has lived under Russian occupation, I really appreciate Western-style liberal democracies. But also living in one of them now, I see how much of not just politics in Western liberal democracies, but also public discourse around this politics, how much it's full of feel-good politics and not do-good politics. And so I find it very ironic when two feel-good kind of approaches of, we feel good about environment, not using fossil fuels, and we want to also feel good about saving little Ukrainian children, from freezing in their beds. And then these two things collide, and then we don't know what to do. So, I'd like to say to Australian audience, if you want, to have your cake and to eat it too, and to get both, then no. And if you want to really help, real help often comes with some sacrifices. It's not just about, feeling good. So the question is what you are ready to sacrifice. Is it about aspirations for fossil fuel? Is it about relationship with China, perhaps, and trade relationship with China? What else it can be? But it's hard to not do anything significant, but also feel good.
Paul, is this something you're passionate about?
I think Australia should do more because, as a matter of principle, we should protect our allies. And obviously, we can't let Russian rock stack keep invading. And if Russian success, then what happens to Taiwan? So really, as a matter of principle, we've got to do our utmost.
So you see it as a principal kind of test case almost, so that there aren't
absolutely
other states like China incentivised?
Yeah, in the same way, if North Korea, attacking South Korea, the American, our ally, have the responsibility to do their utmost. This is a big test.
And you don't feel like we're doing enough?
I think we can do a bit more. I mean, Penny Wong didn't respond, so we should do our utmost.
No, yeah, I agree with you, especially at the point that Australian, perhaps especially, but generally Western support to Ukraine often lacks kind of grander strategy of what we are doing and why we are doing it and why it matters. Because a lot of, like it's very ambiguous. We're getting a lot of mixed messages. Like, on the one hand, guys, you are fighting for all of us. It's not just Ukraine's personal problem.
You're fighting for the Western world.
For the Western world. On the other hand, it often feels like we are getting help out of charity, or just like out of good-heartedness, and then. Like this coal story is just one in a series. Yeah. Like a couple months ago, there was a case when Ukraine targeted several oil storage facilities in Russia, on the territory of Russia, and the first reaction of the United States was like, "Oh, just pull back. We don't want that before the election, the oil prices, Yeah. And it always reminds me of this like really big inequality in the sense that for Ukrainians it's existential.
Yeah.
Really existential
Julian,
struggle.
the West has lost some of its enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, or whether it had it in the first place. I mean, it always
it talked big at the start, right?
Yeah, I mean, looking at it from Washington, where I'm based and where I live, there was a sense of, OK, now that they held off the Russians at the gates of Kyiv, we're going to support them in defending what they have. But there was this fear that there would be, catastrophic success on the part of the Ukrainians, and they'd go into Crimea, and the Russians would get really angry, and there would be this war, this threat of a wider war. And so, for a long time, the US, who are, let's face it, are the biggest suppliers, was supplying just enough for Ukraine to survive, but not to win. And the consequences of that is a limbo in which many tens of thousands of people have died.
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, this is... we had an interview with Zelensky in the paper the other day in which he said everybody worries about escalation. Everybody talks to me about escalation and we should avoid escalation. He says, but the escalating number of dead Ukrainians doesn't seem to matter in that calculation. And I wondered, Alisa, really, I mean, it's quite clear, and it must be clear to you also, sir, that the United States and Australia and all these countries are not willing to go to war for Ukraine, which is the ultimate commitment. Let's face it. If you are serious about saving Ukrainians, you should be willing to go to war to save them. They're not willing to do that. That's quite clear, right? It's also, it seems to me, and maybe you will disagree, it also seems to me that it's impossible for Ukraine to defeat Russia militarily on its own.
I guess so.
So we are really stuck. This is limbo in a true sense, right? We are between saving Ukraine and it being able to save itself. And I wonder then, what do you do? What is there a political horizon? What is the strategy?
Well, I don't know what is the strategy, but I think we keep returning. Actually, we spoke about it. Julian mentioned it in relation to Trump. We just keep returning, I think, to the problem that whatever united or not very united West is, the global strategy is kind of very short-sighted or absent. And so with Ukraine it's very clear, so, OK, let's do something to pull through this month. And then we don't know
But what is the
happens.
outcome that you as a Ukrainian could accept?
Well, that's a very good question because my position here aligns with the position of Ukrainian government, and it's a very rare case, actually, because I disagree with the Ukrainian government on many issues. But the Ukrainian government says that we want our whole territory in the borders of 1991 back. And I agree about that because I am from that territory that was taken in 2014. And so, you know, in the US, they often propose Ukraine like, oh, just give away some land for peace. Or why don't we make it like Korea? Look, South Korea lives great. And my reaction to that is,
No.
Excuse me, what about North Korea?
Yes, indeed.
What about those guys like me who are from North Korea? Just like suggest to dump us, you know, somewhere there for the sake of pushing it under the rug.
But what if...
And also, I mean, the idea that Putin would take a certain amount of Ukraine and say,
right,
fine,
that's
done.
enough for me now.
That's a delusion.
Sort of, it wouldn't be consistent with his character. Our final question is from Shireen Al-Shala.
Hi. So this question is to the panel. I wanted to ask you how you balance the personal and the cultural when you are writing. So how much, when you are or doing your work, how much do you see yourselves as writing personal stories or talking about personal things, and how much do you see yourselves as representatives of your communities?
That's a really good question. Abdulrazak?
Yeah, I don't see myself as representative of anybody. I see, of course, that doesn't mean that I'm a lone voice. It means simply that I'm not on a platform to speak for others. I speak just for myself. But I don't live on an island on my own.
No.
So what I care about and what strikes me as unjust or something worth speaking about, no doubt strikes others as well. But it's important, it seems to me, to be able to say that I don't speak for anybody else. And my voice, therefore, is not one that is, you know, silencing others. I speak for myself. And if it echoes or resonates with others, well and good. If I happen to be out there speaking, shouting into the wind, too bad. That's what I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Julian, you've written recently, in fact, that's why you're here at the Sydney Writers' Festival, about your own family's Holocaust story. Reflecting on that question, do you think of it as an individual story of your family or the broader, you know, Jewish story that is clearly, you know, replicated in so many families?
I think I started out because of the nature of the book, where there were these small adverts in the Manchester Guardian advertising Jewish kids from Vienna looking for people who would look after them so they could be saved. And I was excited about the stories of these different children. But once I decided to write the book, it became clear that I actually also had to write the story of my own family. And if I was going to tell it, I had to tell it warts and all and honestly. And I found that, especially as my whole life has been to be out of the picture and be a reporter, to some extent, that's always a fiction, that you're always kind of in the picture that you're observing. But that was my training. So that was the hardest thing to me, certainly.
As a journalist, to tell your own story.
to use, I always, hate the word, the use of the first person pronoun. Yeah. And that was the hardest barrier to cross, yeah.
That's really interesting. Deborah, I'd love to end tonight's discussion with you, because you're here on Reconciliation Week, and that question really about the way you storytell and your work and representing, it's so important to represent, but how do you view it? When you come here and you're speaking, do you feel that kind of community representation obligation, or do you come to us just as Deborah, the incredible soprano?
Well, I agree with my colleagues here that I speak for myself, and if there is resonance, then that is important to acknowledge as well. I think it must be personal. The undifferentiated other has allowed for the greatest crimes against humanity in the world.
That's right.
And so it really must be personal. And as truthful as you can make it. And in finding that truth, you'll connect with others and hopefully strengthen our society through it.
Really powerfully said. And that's all we have time for. Thank you to our incredible panel, Alisa Sopova, Maher Mughrabi, Julian Borger, Deborah Cheetham Fraillon and Abdulrazak Gurnah. Now, Alisa, Julian and Abdulrazak were in Australia for the Sydney Writers' Festival, and thank you to all of you for sharing your stories and, of course, your questions. Next week, I'll be with you live from Sydney. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Joining our panel, Nick Bryant, Michael Gawenda, Jennifer Robinson and Jonathan Biggins. It'll be a great show. Good night.
Tomorrow on News Breakfast, Richard